I'm Jeff Collin, Professor of Global Health Policy at the University of Edinburgh and an expert advisor at the Institute of Alcohol Studies. And I'm really delighted to be chairing today's session, which I think is a particularly important one, particularly timely, given the renewed salience of alcohol industry corporate social responsibility in the context of COVID, which this really has highlighted a number of key challenges and risks that I think advocates, researchers, policymakers need to engage with more fully than they have done. And secondly, this is also timely because of increasing recognition that CSR and corporate philanthropy are absolutely central to alcohol industry marketing and therefore need to be considered in the context of strengthening national approaches to regulation, and importantly, in the context of developing international approaches to the regulation of industry marketing. I'm also particularly excited by the panel. We have today three really excellent speakers who will be offering distinctive and I think very complementary perspectives before, as I say, leaving plenty of space for us to discuss the issues raised.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, this presentation will look at the sustainability commitments of alcohol producers in relation to CSR, but also more specifically in relation to the marketing functions of CSR. So in this 15-minute presentation, I'll draw on some illustrative examples of how CSR commitments related to sustainability often perform a marketing function. And I'll use three examples that taken from a background paper that we've done from the WHO. So in terms of definition of corporate responsibility and how CSR relates to sustainability, corporate social responsibility, or CSR, has become an increasingly significant part of global health and development. It's widely viewed as good for business, both in terms of enhancing economic performance, but also promoting the strategic objectives of the firm. CSR is often depicted as integrating social, environmental, human rights, and ethical practices into core business operations and strategies. So the social responsibility of businesses, including alcohol producers, is often presented as both maximizing shared value for shareholders, but also for society more broadly. And CSR is really framed by businesses as them actively preventing and mitigating the potentially adverse impacts of their practices. So put simply, CSR is framed as a kind of virtuous circle in which there's a mutual advantage for both the economic performance of businesses, but also the ability of these businesses to deliver social benefits. And just this is quite a nice kind of quote that encapsulates that previous slide. But really, the idea of CSR is becoming increasingly core to the market and political strategies of business actors. So rather than a peripheral concern, it really has become quite central to how businesses operate in terms of their marketing and also in terms of their political strategies, such as kind of lobbying or self-regulation. CSR is quite a malleable concept. It's often referred to using different labels, such as corporate citizenship, global citizenship, and corporate giving. But I think the key point here really is that CSR, under its various guises, has largely replaced kind of more ad hoc approaches to philanthropy. And really, there's been a move much more towards very strategic, often quite long-term approaches to philanthropic activities. And I think the centrality of CSR for core business activities is quite nicely illustrated by the development of the ISO 26000, which is a voluntary standard on social responsibility that many of the world's largest multinational companies have signed up to, including AB InBev and Coca-Cola. And this ISO standard defines social responsibility as the responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and development. And it describes the purpose of CSR as contributing explicitly to sustainable development, including health and societal welfare. And we see the increasing centrality of CSR to core business practices in the integration of the UN Sustainable Development Goals into the socially responsible practices of alcohol companies. So on this slide here, on the left is Pernod Ricard's 2030 Sustainable and Responsibility Roadmap to the SDGs, which draws on many of the SDG goals and kind of links its business practices to the SDG agenda. On the right is AB InBev's 2025 sustainability goals, which includes things such as water stewardship and their voluntary marketing code on responsible drinking. And similarly, it explicitly uses SDG branding and kind of visuals to promote its CSR activities. And so really the kind of picture that emerges, and particularly in terms of the sustainability initiatives here, you can see that sustainability really is quite core to the CSR practices, but also that companies are and alcohol producers such as AB InBev take this very seriously. They have dedicated websites, strategies that really explicitly draw on the kind of the branding and the visuals of the SDG agenda, and it really is quite a key framework for their CSR activities, and also for some of their marketing functions of these activities, which I'll explore in some of the later slides. So in terms of corporate social responsibility and marketing specifically, the assumption that CSR can generate win-win outcomes and be this virtuous circle has been quite strongly challenged in the public health and business management literatures, which note the strategic advantages of CSR for industries linked with damaging impacts in the environment, particularly industries such as tobacco, ultra-processed foods, fossil fuels and alcohol. And critiques of CSR within the public health literature are really centered on the tension between the damaging health and environmental impacts of the core business practices of unhealthy commodity industries and the CSR activities. And this is really in the alcohol sphere. These critiques are exemplified by research on so-called responsible drinking initiatives, particularly in terms of highlighting how these self-regulatory initiatives preempt more effective forms of regulation. But beyond the public health literature, the business studies literature has also highlighted the marketing functions of CSR, which is slightly less explored in the public health literature. And that's something we focused on in this paper that we'd done for the WHO. And it's really looking at how CSR can explicitly be used for marketing purposes. And we draw here on the concept of, I guess, the corporate level concept of image and corporate branding and reputation to highlight the marketing functions of CSR activities. And our argument really, or what we found, was that CSR activities can really provide quite very valuable marketing activities, not simply in terms of promoting a specific product, but also in terms of corporate level concepts. So things like a brand and an image. And I'll explore that in the next few slides. So the first form of CSR marketing I'd like to highlight is cause-related marketing and sustainability. And this will be familiar to many of you, in which corporations link monetary or in-kind donations to product sales. And this is really a key mechanism for many alcohol industry sustainability initiatives. The example I'm drawing on here is of AB InBev's promotion of its Stella Artois brand through its Buy a Lady a Drink initiative. And this draws on quite well-established alcohol CSR activities around pink washing, where products are associated with breast cancer awareness. In this example, the sales of Stella are linked to the provision of water. And the campaign, which is run across various Latin American countries and South Africa and Australia, is promoted in partnership with water.org. And really this is, I mean, a very overt example of cause-related marketing where sustainability and CSR are linked more or less explicitly to sales of a product. And this is just one example of the marketing function and how it relates to sustainability. A second example of cause-related marketing is also food security. So in addition to water stewardship, food security is often a very commonly used strategy. The example I have on the slide here is from 2017, where South African breweries, as part of SABMiller, which is now part of AB InBev, launched its Beers for Africa initiative. And so this campaign featured a mixed crate of different beers from various African countries, with the company promising to donate 3 student meals for each pack sold. And then in an interview for the Beers for Africa campaign, the Vice President of Marketing for SABMiller explained that this concept was all about offering our South African beers to the rest of the world. And on top of that, what we wanted to do was focus on our sustainability goals and ensure that we use their scale and their business as a tool to solve one of the biggest problems in Africa, and that's hunger. So this campaign was piloted in South Africa with plans to extend it to other countries. Eventually it was abandoned in response to pressure from public health advocacy groups who accused the alcohol industry of using poverty to promote beer sales. However, over the past 2 years in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a number of initiatives around food security and cause-related marketing, particularly used by the alcohol industry. I mean, to offer one example, AB InBev again promised to donate 1 in every 5 loaves of a limited edition bread that they made using their Leffe beer brand. And those donations were made to the Belgian Federation of Food Banks. So that's one example of how these types of initiatives have continued and arguably proliferated actually over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think food security is really, both alcohol and food companies have used food security quite strategically in their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So moving on to a second marketing function and a second type of CSR activity linked to sustainability, which is corporate philanthropy. So corporate philanthropy can be defined as a corporation making a direct contribution to a charity or cause in the form of donations or in-kind services. And this has really been a key mechanism by which alcohol producers have used sustainability commitments as an opportunity for brand marketing. So while cause-related marketing is often used to promote specific products or brands, philanthropy is much more about corporate level concepts of kind of identity, overall corporate image and reputation. So many leading alcohol companies have established foundations that bear their corporate name, and this is a mechanism that they use to advance sustainability goals. The example I'm using here is the Pernod Ricard Foundation, and it's India's social impact incubator. And this incubator offers grants and donations to support sustainability initiatives that align with the company's strategic objectives, specifically water stewardship, food security, and education. So Pernod Ricard described this incubator as directed explicitly towards achieving SDG goals and towards achieving this kind of wider agenda. And that allows it to frame itself really as a kind of a key partner of the UN and a key partner in achieving the SDG agenda. So while corporate foundations enhance the corporate image and reputation of companies like Pernod Ricard, CSR initiatives also have a more direct marketing function. So in the case of the social impact incubator, Pernod Ricard have often used this to promote women entrepreneurs. And this has really helped to kind of reinforce the long-standing industry initiatives to associate women's alcohol consumption with being a marker of economic and social independence. So corporate philanthropy can often perform a number of different marketing functions, both in terms of corporate level kind of brand reputation improvement, but also quite specific marketing functions or linking alcohol consumption to sort of key demographics and key markets. And the second example is the Heineken Africa Foundation. And many foundations partner with NGOs in terms of things like water stewardship. In this case, Heineken Africa partnered with WaterAid to donate 1.2 million euros to support its emergency response to COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, this is another example, one of many, where corporate foundations bearing a company's name are used as an opportunity to kind of market a brand, build reputations, and enhance legitimacy. So finally, the final example I'd like to highlight is socially responsible business practices. And this involves a corporation implementing discretionary business practices that support community well-being. It's often framed as contributing to the SDG agenda. Socially responsible practices are very similar to cause-related marketing in terms of often providing space for product marketing. This is probably arguably the most visible in responsible drinking campaigns, which are often promoted as part of much broader corporate citizenship initiatives. A key example of this is AB InBev's Smart Drinking Goals, which it explicitly links to the UN SDGs. And AB InBev described this as meeting UN SDG Goal 3 to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all. And clearly this offers opportunities for product promotion and kind of brand marketing. I've used two examples here of how AB InBev have used its Smart Drinking Goals as an opportunity to more or less explicitly promote alcoholic products, including kind of low to no alcohol products. And finally, the final example I'd like to speak about really is how, as part of socially responsible business practices, alcohol producers are increasingly engaged with environmental concerns as part of their CSR. And frequently, this has involved efforts to really integrate sustainability within core business practices. The example I'm using here is Brewdog, which I think is a really interesting example where we might see other alcohol producers move, which is in terms of its it purchased a lost forest, well, what it calls a lost forest, but a large amount of woodland in the Scottish Highlands that it claims will be used for native woodland restoration and peatland restoration. So Brewdog have used this to market a specific beer, where it linked sales of this lost forest edition lager. It linked that to commitments to kind of plant trees. What's interesting about this initiative is that Brewdog received grants from the Scottish Government through a woodland forestry grant scheme. So for all the trees it plants, it actually receives quite significant subsidies for doing so. So there's really, for Brewdog and potentially for other alcohol companies that use this as part of their net zero campaign, really quite a kind of win-win, where not only do they receive subsidies for socially responsible practices, but they can also use it as a marketing opportunity. What I think is particularly interesting about Brewdog is really how central this campaign is to their core marketing strategy. So Brewdog have used this forest that they bought as the core of their entire brand identity and their marketing strategy, which is to present themselves as planet's favorite beer. And I think this is a really striking example of how CSR, sustainability, and marketing can really come together. And as I say, I think we will see more alcohol companies using this as part of their net zero and using it as a marketing opportunity. So that concludes the presentation. Apologies for running over by a couple of minutes. I mean, these are really the key takeaways, but essentially that CSR can offer very significant marketing opportunities for alcohol companies. And then increasingly we'll see CSR, sustainability, and marketing kind of come together and really form much more of a core part of the business practices of alcohol companies. And I'll leave it there and hand over to Jeff. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. Yeah, great to be here. Yes, as Jeff was saying, I'm keen to look at how the alcohol lobbies tried and tested over the years their tactics to crowd out effective policy interventions with these voluntary measures and commitments. So where Rob was looking at kind of the marketing and reputational aspects, I'll be looking at the policy and advocacy impacts, recognizing that these sort of voluntary commitments and these CSR activities are, you know, at the kind of baseline level, these are lobbying tactics deployed by the industry. What I find really fascinating, and I'll paint a picture of this bit for you, is how these are rolled out globally, how they're now being deployed all over the world, which is something I've been able to observe in my current role and as being part of the Spectrum Consortium with Jeff and Rob as well. First of all, I wanted to start on a positive note. I'm sure many of you are already aware, but WHO is stepping up their approach to commercial determinants of health and the health harming industries as a part of that. They put out a new fact sheet on commercial determinants in November, where for the first time they've characterized what this actually means in practice. They've said corporations commonly influence public health through lobbying and party donations. This incentivizes politicians and parties to align decisions with commercial agendas. Further, corporations work to capture branches of government to shape their preferred regulatory regime, leading to unregulated activity, limiting their liability and bypassing the threat of litigation and preemption. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that as a description. So as we've already heard, the industry's voluntary commitments, their CSR commitments, their voluntary codes of practice, promotion of self-regulation, these are all in the same vein, part of their arsenal of lobbying tactics and these aims to capture decision makers at various levels to convince them not to adopt and implement the effective policy measures that we know about, including the SAFER package of WHO. Yes, I mean, there's a 30-year odd track record of industries drink responsibly campaigns, for example, and they've been the centerpiece of the voluntary guidelines for alcohol. But we know very, very well that these are not effective. You know, widespread reviews of hundreds and hundreds of studies that finds that these have not worked in general. These have been overall a failure, so it kind of exposes the real rationale for doing this. And as you know, as part of the Spectrum Consortium, we've been looking at more recent activities during the context and during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic so far. And yeah, some brilliant examples there from Rob, many of which that I hadn't seen before, of just how they're trying to exploit the vulnerabilities and the sensitivities of the populations during the pandemic to equate their products to kind of essential products or essential services, positioning themselves via branded donations of things like hand sanitizer, for example, very actively using these opportunities to promote their brands to the target audiences in traditional and social media. And we're increasingly seeing, as Rob was saying, that this is going towards women, this is going towards youth, but this is also increasingly going towards lower middle income countries. We're observing, for example, how Africa is being perceived as the next frontier, as well as some countries in South Asia as well. It's really important to note that the time frame for a lot of these kind of pandemic related voluntary commitments and CSR exercises is overlapped entirely with the consultation processes for World Health Organization to develop a proposal for a new global alcohol action plan. That's meant to improve and fill some of the gaps of the global alcohol strategy, which has been in place for many years already and hasn't been as effective as intended, in part due to the industry tactics to water it down and deflect and distract from the recommended measures. So that proposed global alcohol action plan is going to be formally considered by governments at the World Health Assembly this year, starting with deliberations at the executive board meeting of WHO, which starts on the 24th of this month. From our perception, the kind of stepping up of this voluntary approach and the CSR commitments during the pandemic has been both defensive as well as on the offense. You know, there were measures that came in, like the one in South Africa, where the government decided to very strictly restrict sales and availability of alcohol in a way to relieve pressure on emergency services and intensive care beds, which it did to a great extent. But obviously the industry was very intensively lobbying to reverse that decision and to ensure that other governments didn't think of following suit. They were really well positioned to do that with their voluntary commitments and their promises over time. Obviously, they had 3 decades or more of practice in undertaking these kind of tactics and the voluntary commitments over many, many years and in different regulatory contexts. Jeff mentioned that I was previously with the European Public Health Alliance, and we were initially part of the European Alcohol and Health Forum, which was a stakeholder forum which included industry lobbyists as well as civil society, and all of those stakeholders were asked to define voluntary commitments to reduce health harm from alcohol. but there was no quality control whatsoever of the kind of commitments that were undertaken and whether they'd actually be beneficial to public health. There was no kind of smart indicators about what the actual impacts of those would be. So in effect, industry just undertook business as usual commitments. But then this actually did more harm than good, because it sort of gave them a glow. It gave the impression of endorsement from the European Union of these kind of actions, which centered largely, of course, on educational actions and promotion of responsible drinking. Even to the extent of promoting responsible drinking messages in primary schools across Europe. So obviously this was very much the moment when civil society realized that we needed to walk away. It had been packaged and promoted to civil society as kind of a carrot to which the stick would follow if it didn't work for public health benefit, but clearly it never did. So NGOs left that forum. And when I joined the NCD Alliance, which works at the global level, exchanging with colleagues from different parts of the world, we realized that exactly the same tactics, exactly these same kind of fora that were supposed to be stakeholder convenings on the basis of voluntary commitments were also used in Mexico, were also used in South Africa, for example. So these really are global tactics. NCD Alliance put out a publication a few years ago called Fool Me Twice, which together with Vital Strategies and IOGT, predecessor of Mavendi, and GAPA, looked at how these kind of tactics have been used over and over again. And these lessons certainly still need to be learned, and we're certainly working with colleagues in lower income countries to make sure that these we can't be fooled a third or a fourth time. We also had a deeper dive. There was a study by Catherine Robina, Thomas Babor, Ilana Pinsky, and Paula Johns that we brought out in 2020 on the alcohol industry's commercial and political activities in Latin America and the Caribbean, which we released together with GAPA, FURUT, Healthy Latin America Coalition, CLAS, and the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. And I know there are some colleagues from those organizations with us today. I mean, we found that it was absolutely systemic across Latin America and the Caribbean, but importantly as well, that these are really effective advocacy tactics and that they've worked out for the industry. So just as a couple of examples, in Bogota in Colombia in 2009, the mayor had issued a decree forbidding the sale of alcoholic drinks in off-trade establishments between 11 in the evening and 10 in the morning, with the aim, which actually was proven to serve to reduce violence and crime on the streets of Bogota. So that was working well, but then the industry and the Chamber of Commerce made a commitment to self-regulate sales and prevent consumption in public places. And as a result, that ban was lifted. Similar experience in Brazil a few years earlier. There was an interministerial group established, set up to define a national policy in Brazil on alcohol advertising. And then the industries, both the advertising industry and the alcohol industry, got together to revise a voluntary code of marketing as a way of kind of deflecting that and fending that off. But whilst they were doing it, their own code defined alcohol as products with an alcohol content at such a level so that both beer and wine were excluded. So, I mean, you see how these tactics have worked in different contexts all over the world. We also know Institute for Alcohol Studies, Catherine was a co-author of a WHO study, again with Tom Babor a couple of years ago, which looked at, I think, over 3,000 voluntary commitments from the industry. And looked at in greater detail at around 700 and found that only 0.1% of them were consistent with the best buys for prevention and control of NCDs. Yeah, they just didn't serve the purpose. Obviously, they are in place to deflect away from actually efficient regulation and policy measures and undermine the WHO best buys, the recommended policy interventions, and that safer technical package, which obviously focus on availability, affordability, and restrictions to advertising. We saw most recently in the consultations on the new WHO Global Action Plan that the industry is continuing to deploy the tactics. They're talking about their own voluntary commitments, they're burnishing their sustainability credentials, they're obviously trying to keep the narrative only to the harmful use of alcohol, as if there were a level which were not harmful, and talking about the benefits of trade. We know that the alcohol lobby is very, very active in Geneva over recent months, and even going back more than a year, meeting as many missions that are present in Geneva as possible and talking about trade. And it's important to think that in the Geneva advocacy context, which is why it's so important that we as health advocates are also present. A lot of the attaches, a lot of the ambassadors and diplomats that are looking at WHO decision-making processes may also be their country's representatives to the World Trade Organization or the International Labour Organization, who are also present in Geneva. Especially for the smaller countries, the ambassadors and diplomats often hold multiple policy portfolios. And so they're very receptive maybe to pressure about the trade arguments or the employment arguments as well. And we know very well that alcohol, the industry continues to paint themselves, as Rob was saying, as well as a key partner to the UN across the whole suite of the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially Goal 17, which is all about partnerships. So it opens a door to them to, you know, host high-profile events, receptions, burnish their credentials again, talk about trade interests, and ultimately offer incentives, maybe implicit or explicit, to missions represented in Geneva to block or delay progress on health decisions. As we were also saying, and I think it was mentioned on a previous session in this series, we see a very serious risk of attempting to capture WHO as well via the new WHO Foundation, which is potentially opening the door to alcohol industry donors or other entities affiliated with the industry, whereas they had been firmly on a red list. There was a version of the basically rules and regulations of the foundation which made it look like they were going to go onto an orange list. So that would suggest there's been a lot of background lobbying to try and open the door to alcohol economic vested interest to get in and start donating to WHO Foundation, which extremely important that we ensure that that doesn't happen and block off that potential for further influence directly potentially over WHO. WHO's position on the alcohol industry was much clearer under the previous Director General, Margaret Chan, whereas Dr. Tedros, the current DG, has been much more open to looking at diversifying funding sources. So it's extremely important that civil society is really vigilant about this. So just to wrap up, I mean, obviously conclusions and recommendations, looking at what's going to happen with the WHO Global Action Plan. I think civil society needs to ensure that the governments and the international institutions don't keep making the same mistake again. You know, as noted, you know, many instances, there's a need for guidance, and actually member states of WHO are asking for guidance and guidelines on how to interact with the industry. Obviously around tobacco, this is extremely clear. You've got the Framework Convention on Alcohol Control, and we would need something very similar for the alcohol industry as well. We've been asking for many years WHO to cease the bilateral industry dialogue with the alcohol lobby. And it's extremely important for all of us, yes, both civil society and academic experts, to continue monitoring this influence and the impact that it's had. I appreciate I'm telling you many things that you will already know, so I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll hand back to you, Jeff. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nina. That was great. I particularly enjoyed the you setting us up with the encouraging bits about WHO and the commercial determinants of health, and then the complexities of the ongoing difficulties of trying to push this agenda consistently, even within WHO, are really quite remarkable. I was flitting off, kind of linking to Rob's COVID-focused stuff, and you know the significance of David Nabarro, WHO's special envoy on COVID, who has lobbied fairly actively on behalf of alcohol companies in the context of UN meetings, and it just kind of vividly illustrates how challenging these questions are. So I'm glad to say we're getting some questions coming through now. I would encourage colleagues to contribute more questions via the chat function, please. But we've the first question that I'll pose to Rob, if I may, from Gail Amul of the Asia Pacific Alcohol Alliance, who asks whether about the significance of impact assessment and management frameworks based on the Sustainable Development Goals, ISO's, UN Principles for Responsible Development, and is asking about their relevance in terms of the use of sustainability and CSR by the alcohol industry to promote its good corporate citizenship. Do we see a kind of a significant relationship between the two, do you think?
Yeah, between CSR and impact assessments.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of what I presented, I mean, I think there probably is a relationship between the two. Certainly, in terms of how alcohol companies have presented sustainability and CSR initiatives in their kind of environmental reporting, and I think there has been a kind of noticeable trend towards sustainability commitments, particularly environmental practices, socially responsible practices around environmental issues being kind of packaged out into their own sort of distinct, sort of separate reports, where previously they were kind of integrated into these kind of broader types of impact assessment or kind of annual reporting that alcohol producers or food producers would do. So I think there definitely is an important relationship between the two. In terms of kind of research on it, I definitely think that more could be done on both on the marketing functions of CSR, but also how marketing functions and the political functions of CSR and sustainability, kind of the interplay between them. But as I say, I mean, in the report we did, it was noticeable that companies like AB InBev and Diageo were clearly making quite a conscious effort to sort of package out some of the environmental CSR activities that we're doing into kind of independent reports that they could then present on kind of websites, or present as being kind of very closely aligned with the SDGs. And as I say, in the final example that I presented on Brewdog, the Scottish beer company, I mean, their entire marketing strategy it is completely bound up in the kind of types of impact assessments it's doing around woodland restoration, and kind of net zero commitments. So they're so closely intertwined, to the extent that they have, I mean, they've appointed expert advisors, like scientific advisors, to sort of produce reports for them that link their work into COP26, into not just the SDGs, but much more broadly in terms of climate change. And part of that is about, they produced a number of reports that sort of and publish kind of impact assessments on kind of what they're doing in CSR and kind of how that advances kind of the SDG agenda. So yeah, I think it's important. As I say, it's not something there's a huge amount of research on, and I definitely think it's an area that should be explored.
Yeah, sorry, I'll abuse Chair's action. I agree. I mean, I think there's very clear ways in which alcohol industry are very consciously kind of mimicking and replicating impact assessment and other frameworks as a way of kind of enhancing the legitimacy of their various CSR initiatives, and, to use Mark's phrase, the work that those initiatives are supposed to be doing. You know, you'd see that in kind of replicating SDG wheels and SDG imagery, and the various ways in which alcohol companies are very clearly mimicking those kind of frameworks is important, and as Rob says, I think it merits much further study. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Gail. The second question is for Nina, and from Sarah Hill, now of the University of Sydney, and she's asking Nina, without wanting to get her in trouble too much, a question about WHO's position on alcohol funding and variation and inconsistencies on that. And Sarah's question is about the extent to which WHO's ambiguity on alcohol makes it difficult for member states to take a clearer position in seeking to manage potential conflicts of interest in health policy and programs. So I guess there's also a kind of a sort of second element to that question about whether WHO's position is itself reflecting the ambiguities among the member states. I think there's unpacking chicken and egg in those in this relationship is always a tricky one.
Yeah, absolutely. I very much agree with the point that Sarah's making. It's you know, offering guidance and guidelines on the one hand, and then doing something completely different with the other at WHO. As I said, Margaret Chan was extremely clear and kind of grouped the alcohol industry together with the tobacco industry as an entity that they wouldn't partner with at all. Whereas, as I said before, so WHO have bilateral dialogues with some selected industries. Obviously, they're not allowed to have it with tobacco, but they do have it with alcohol, and they do have it with the food industry and the sports industry. This is something that we've pushed back against and said, okay, that's not the right signal to be sending, exactly as you're saying, because that sets the example for member states as well. I mean, you have to sympathise with WHO to some extent in that you see where they're coming from. Their annual budget is about the same as a city hospital in the US. We're talking like a couple of $1 billion a year for the mandate and the expectations that they have for national governments. So there's a separate conversation going on about sustainable WHO financing and how they should get more from core contributions from member states, from governments, so that they're not so we're increasingly dependent on other stakeholders, on philanthropies, or, as I said, via the WHO Foundation. That's opening the door for corporate entities to be able to give them donations as well. So yeah, both of those aspects are extremely worrying. Member states are asking WHO actively for that sort of guidance because they're confused, frankly, and they want to have something to fall back on and push back to the industry and say, well, we don't have to listen to you. Whereas the industry are pushing at them saying, no, we're legitimate stakeholders and you're absolutely obliged to listen to us. So, you know, until WHO kind of gets their house in order with that, it's going to be very difficult for national governments to be able to fend them off, essentially. And then that leaves the door open for these kind of activities that are, yeah, I mean, designed to hoodwink, basically. I'll give that back to you, Jeff. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. And I agree, as ever, with WHO, the sort of reconciling sympathy and criticism is a bit difficult, because, you know, to take the WHO Foundation, of course, the fundamental problem is one of states not funding WHO properly. But nonetheless, you know, that doesn't really suffice as an explanation for the clearly inadequate attention that's being paid to governance issues around managing conflict of interest, particularly with the alcohol industry in relation to the WHO Foundation. And I think that remains a really important issue to keep an eye on. You know, Nathan Marnie and colleagues have been leading some work there, and I know it's a significant concern for GAPA and Vivendi and yourselves. That leads neatly into another really lovely question posed by Simone Aratonian from the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, who asks what we can do about the misuse of CSR and the narrative it creates. Mark, I think you've begun to kind of address that question, but it'd be great to hear from first Nina and then Rob, maybe, about, you know, what we can do to counter CSR at regional, local, as well as national and global levels.
Yeah, tough question. I mean, civil society has a huge role to play, obviously, these kind of awareness raising events, but replicate those locally and nationally and just make clear, especially in the countries that are the new frontiers for the industry, that this is going to happen, because what we see is their kind of tried and tested pushback is the same in different regions of the world. As I said, we've seen it in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're increasingly seeing it in Africa and South Asia. Yeah, so I think civil society, but it has to go further than that. And as we were saying before, kind of WHO really needs to be clearer in their guidance. And I was really pleased to see the comment from Juan from the WHO European office. We'll do our best as well to communicate this to the higher levels of management of WHO, that it undermines your case. I mean, one thing I was going to mention as well, and several of you know, the WHO Foundation also took some money from Nestle, which is absolutely not allowed. It's against the rule book. There's the International Code on Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, and yet they took a couple of $1 million from Nestle through the foundation. So there's clearly a mismatch. You know, their due diligence in some ways, especially in relation to tobacco, is extremely vigilant. And then, you know, junk food and alcohol is a very, enormous risk that they slip through the net because of the desperation for resources at the moment. What else can we do? Yeah, just keep saying it. You know, we have 30 years of experience of these tactics now. They're tried and tested. We should be able to call them out, but that needs to get more widely into the public narrative, as well as, I mean, all of these egregious examples that Rob and Mark have presented. They're absolutely stunning, aren't they? And being clearer on things like where regulation is in place, just try and preempt how it would be subverted and undermined, things like the labelling requirements. I worked on labelling requirements previously in kind of environmental policy, and there it's much more strictly regulated, or in tobacco indeed, you know, the size of the labels, they have to take up a minimum proportion of the packaging, they have to be certain colours, or they can't be other colours, it has to be easily readable and so on. I mean, if you leave any little chink in the armour, then absolutely the industry are gonna exploit that. I think these are stories that would very much interest the wider public as well, to see how they're being manipulated. It's a different issue, but something as Mark and Rob were also talking about, kind of pink washing and reaching out to women. I thought it was absolutely, yeah, it blew me away that when the WHO published the first draft of the global alcohol action plan that was coming out, then yeah, lobbyists in the UK spotted an issue with that, which was they could spin it as it being sexist and picking out women and portraying women as kind of naive or something like that. So they obviously used it very intentionally to try and get WHO and certainly the proposal sort of cancelled on social media. And, you know, I have friends who follow kind of feminist discussion groups on social media, and they absolutely fell for it, and they were furious, and they were coming to me and saying, what on earth is WHO doing? So yeah, just try and anticipate all of these tactics. There's no depth that they won't plumb to get there. And yeah, this you know, tactic of figuring out who can we use, who can we make angry to get them cancelled essentially by social media, I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on, I guess, sort of Nina's point about broader sort of public awareness of the kind of nature of CSR strategies as they relate to sustainability. I mean, everyone on this call is aware of its kind of the political functions or marketing functions of CSR. But in terms of, I mean, for me, it's that what's maybe distinctive about the SDG agenda, about sustainability CSR activities, is specifically as they relate to marketing, is this real, the blurring between what constitutes advertising and what constitutes socially responsible business practice or social cause. And I mean, I always go back to the Brewdog example, but it's so, the CSR is so integrated into their core marketing strategy that it's genuinely, I think that the issue for regulation is being able to differentiate between the two. And I think Simone's question actually did mention what can be done while waiting for regulation. But I mean, I think it is important to both to highlight the kind of marketing function of these sustainability commitments to, and for public health advocacy organizations to highlight that and to make publics kind of aware of what's being done in terms of things like net zero commitments, which a broader public understanding of that might be that that's kind of unambiguously a good thing, that an alcohol company might do that. And I do think there is probably more that needs to be done in terms of raising awareness, but I guess secondly, that it is worth looking at kind of best practice models of regulation like France's Loi Van, which does include CSR as part of its in its regulatory coverage of alcohol marketing, and so to look at that as a kind of best practice of where that might be extended to other jurisdictions in terms of taking the marketing functions of CSR activities seriously and sort of including them in regulation. So I guess those would be the 2 points, but I get mainly to kind of reiterate what Nina said about kind of wider public understandings and the need for more advocacy efforts around that.
Cool. Thanks. So sorry again, I'm going to abuse chair's privilege horribly, but you know, Nina invoking the various furores around the WHO global action plan. You know, the ongoing need to be really cautious about creating scope for alcohol industry wins in the way in which that action plan is framed is something that I know a number of colleagues on the call are keeping a very active eye on. You know, certainly the subsequent versions of the plan don't seem to be quite as bad as the first version, which insisted on asserting a positive role for the alcohol industry in every single component of the plan. But it's still certainly a very long way short of what Florence is calling for in terms of an unambiguous assertion of conflict of interest with the alcohol industry. And that leads me on to the final question that I'd like to pose to each of the panelists, which is posed here by Clive Hen, who asks, given the wealth of evidence that voluntary industry actions don't result in public health gains, why do some governments and international organisations continue to pursue them? And I guess that there's also an element of that question, I think about how the alcohol industry is constantly able to present the same old as new and innovative, and an initiative which is essentially rehashing things that they've been doing for 30 years. They're somehow able to shape the discourse in ways that present this as a bold new contribution that's never been attempted before. I'll pose that to Mark in the first instance, because I guess this is asking him to painfully rehash the experience of the work on the public health responsibility deal, but that emphasis on constantly posing partnership and voluntary initiative as new and novel and exciting and even as brave by the alcohol industry is something that I still think we need to do a slightly better job of countering.
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that. I think it's a really interesting question around why are partnerships kind of path dependent, so to speak. And I think there are, again, it's one of those things where it would be great to have more research and kind of better understanding how partnerships can be sort of continually reinvented, and while continuing to do much the same in terms of the kind of interventions. I guess the one thing that I would say, maybe this reflects my own interest, is understanding partnerships as a kind of model of governance, and understanding the kind of logic of collaboration that underpins partnership is a better way to understand why they're so prevalent and why they proliferated so much. And I guess there's not an easy answer. My takeaway from it is that the sort of demonstrating evidence of ineffectiveness is clearly insufficient for partnerships to be kind of disrupted as a kind of model. So it clearly requires a kind of better understanding or better grasp of how to challenge that partnership as a kind of paradigm of policy making rather than individual partnerships themselves. I think it, and maybe one way into it is to sort of take conflicts of interest in health governance kind of more seriously, and to advocate more along those lines as a way to trying to sort of challenge that this paradigm of kind of collaboration and partnership between governments and unhealthy commodity industries.
Cheers, Rob. And I'll give the last word to Nina.
I'm thinking about other industries and other regulatory areas where they've got out of this vicious cycle. And there's an instructive example in CO2 standards for the car industry that came from the EU. It was initially on the basis of a voluntary agreement in the early 2000s, but there was a hard stop to it. We're going to assess this in 2008. And there was accountability both for the car industry as a whole. They had a collective target, kind of an average grams per CO2 per kilometre standard that they had to hit by 2008. And then what NGOs did, where I was before Transport and Environment, we did a company by company analysis. So the whole industry was held accountable by the European Commission, but then company by company, we could show who was doing their bit, basically. And then there was the stick. If you don't hit the voluntary target that you've committed to by 2008, then we're going to come in with proper regulation, because voluntary regulation won't have worked, and we have to bring out the big guns, basically. There was a very different view from the European Commission, Environment Directorate and Industry Directorate at that time. We heard from the car industry head of unit, I'm a regulator, it's my job to regulate. I don't think public health officials necessarily feel empowered to say that kind of thing on a public platform very often. I suppose one parallel to that maybe is Sally Davis, when she was Chief Medical Officer, she was saying, okay, voluntary commitment for SSB, sugary drinks reformulation. If you haven't hit it by a certain date, then a tax is coming in, and actually follow through with it. That's an empowered regulator, I suppose. So yeah, that was a good tandem of empowered regulator plus civil society following up to create accountability brand by brand, and then industry as a whole. So maybe it's worth playing around with, could we create a similar yeah, accountability mechanism and similar productive liaison with the public health regulators to give them a bit more power, a bit more clout, and a bit more confidence to just do it. Basically, simple.
Christina, but I mean, just do it. It's not simple, but as you know, but I think, you know, citing the example from the car industry is important. That, you know, I do think that we very often don't look beyond our usual kind of comfortable comparisons to think about where we can learn lessons, and that there are other models, there are other forms of regulation. You know, we can challenge corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility can be regulated, and we do have a number of models and precedents that we can draw on.